Back in the early 90s, several young women were murdered, and their bodies were dumped in and around the city of Calgary, Alberta, Canada. The victims were mostly street teens and/or alleged sex workers. Both life circumstances which made these girls easy prey. To this date, none of these murders have ever been solved. Many of the murders do appear to be connected. In fact, many people do believe that there is or was a serial killer stalking the streets of Calgary, Alberta. It is difficult to list all of the victims who may have fallen prey to this killer, if the serial killer does in fact exist. But there are approximately 7 murders that share similarities that could be linked to one serial killer beginning around the year 1990. It is indeed possible that all of the cases are unrelated, but given the timeline, similarities in method of murder, and method of disposal, it is also possible that a serial killer did commit these murders. In fact, that is what a lot of people do believe. Police have been pretty tight-lipped about there being a serial killer in Calgary, and through the years, different investigators have had various opinions of which victims may have been killed by the same killer. Some reports suggest the police have ruled out the theory of a serial killer, but former investigator Ron McKay has said, quote, "I was satisfied there was a link in 2 of the Calgary cases. There was enough there to behaviorally link them," unquote. Several of the murders were also potentially linked in a summit in 1993, where RCMP officers met with FBI profilers to discuss several of the cases. Findings from the summit have not been shared with the public, though. In 2003, the RCMP developed Project CARE to investigate the deaths of several vulnerable missing persons in the Edmonton, Alberta area. Later, this unit was expanded and became the Alberta RCMP Missing Persons Unit. Reportedly, some of the murdered young women from Calgary are included in this project, but still to today, the cases remain unsolved. It's hard to exactly pinpoint when the murders began, but I'll start in 1990 with the murder of 17-year-old Joanne Shaver. On January 10, 1990, the body of 17-year-old Joanne Shaver was found dumped on the side of a remote country road on 88th Street Southeast near Shepherd Road. Joanne had been sexually assaulted and strangled. At the time of her murder, Joanne was a ward of Alberta and was living in a group home. According to the Calgary Herald, Joanne had started running away and working in the sex trade at the age of 12. 8 months before Joanne was murdered, her friend Chrissy Mowat had been shot dead by a pimp. Police said that Joanne's killer appeared to have a history of predatory sexual aggression. And although James Arthur Link, a convicted sex offender, was charged with the first-degree murder of Joanne, he was later acquitted. Therefore, technically, Joanne's case remains unsolved. And I mention Joanne's case here because the way she was murdered and dumped has striking similarities with a series of murders of young women that would emerge over the next few years. On June 20th, 1991, at approximately 8:30 a.m., reportedly a 14-year-old boy running late for school found 20-year-old Shauna Vanderbosch's nude body in a ditch beside a rural road southwest of Calgary, about 4.5 kilometers from the Pritis turnoff, north of Highway 22X. Shauna had been strangled. Shauna had lived in Vancouver for most of her life, and she had only just moved to Calgary in March of 1991. She had been working as a hairdresser for Moda Design and allegedly was also an escort. The night before Shauna's body was found, on June 19, 1991, she was hanging out with coworkers at a Calgary restaurant. At approximately 9:30 p.m., Shauna and 2 of her friends attended a benefit fashion show at the Tasmanian Ballroom on 12th Avenue and 1st Street in Calgary. Shauna left the fashion show around 1:30 a.m., and an acquaintance gave her a ride to the corner of Southland Drive and McLeod Trail at approximately 3:30 a.m. This is the last known sighting of Shauna alive. Not even 2 months later, on August 13, 1991, the body of 16-year-old Jennifer Jantz was found in a shallow grave at a construction site along the Trans-Canada Highway near Valley Ridge Road, northwest of Calgary. An autopsy determined that Jennifer had died from a heavy blow to the chest. Rumors began in Calgary that a serial killer was murdering and dumping young women in remote areas of the city. Jennifer had grown up in Calgary in a loving home. She was active in gymnastics, ballet, and track and field. She was described as a kind-hearted, trusting, and an excellent student. But things changed when Jennifer failed grade 7. She dropped out of school after grade 9 and moved in with various friends. Jennifer was spending most of her time on the streets, though she still maintained a relationship with her family. She would call home all the time and was always told by her mother that she was welcome home anytime she wished. As an attempt to help their daughter, Jennifer's parents sent her to a Christian Bible camp in Texas when she was 15. In early 1991, after 2 months, Jennifer returned home, and she seemed to do well for a while, even becoming active in youth groups, and she found herself a job. She even enrolled at James Fowler High School for 6 weeks in February. Jennifer still wasn't living at home, though, and as time went on, she was again being drawn back into the streets of Calgary. In July of 1991, Jennifer became sick with a kidney infection and was treated at the Rocky View Hospital. Every night, her family would visit her. On July 12, 1991, Jennifer called her mother. She said she was leaving the hospital and wanted to come home for supper the following week. The last reported sighting of Jennifer was as she was walking out of the emergency room doors. Still uneasy about a third murdered and dumped young woman in the city, Calgarians would begin to panic when just 2 months later another young woman's body would be found in a shallow grave just 2 kilometers from where Jennifer Jantz had been found. On October 6, 1991, the body of 17-year-old Jennifer Joyce was found in a shallow grave near 77th Street and 13th Street Southwest, Calgary. Jennifer had been missing since August, when she seemingly had vanished from her group home. Jennifer was a ward of the province of Alberta since 1986, when at the age of 12, her mother had died in a car accident. Jennifer's teachers told the local papers that she had, quote, tremendous potential and she was well liked at school, unquote. Jennifer had recently moved to an independent living facility, but like the others before her, she was drawn to life on the streets. Jennifer was reported missing on August 30th, 1991. The cause of Jennifer's death has never been released. If it wasn't clear before, the murder of Jennifer Joyce certainly made it clear something was going on. In less than 2 years, 4 young women, teenagers mostly, had been abducted from the streets of Calgary, murdered and dumped in remote areas in and around the city. The series of murders, though, would not end there. And approximately 18 months later, on March 10, 1992, the skeletal remains of 29-year-old Keely Pincott were found in a shallow grave in a wooded area 2 kilometers northeast of Cochrane, Alberta, off of Highway 1A. Keely was identified through dental records and x-rays, and the cause of her death has never been released. Keely was a mother who was working as a cocktail waitress. In May of 1991, Keely spoke to her mother for the last time. 6 months later, in November of 1991, her mother reported her missing. Keely's body would not be found for several months. About 8 months later, on October 31st, 1992, the beaten and stabbed body of 26-year-old Tracy Monder was found in a grassy field off of Garden Road, southeast Calgary. Tracy was a mother of 2 who was recently diagnosed with cancer and had only been working on the streets of Calgary for about 6 months before she disappeared. She was trying to raise enough money to buy a plane ticket for her son so that he could go stay with his grandmother while Tracy was in treatment. Tracy had been working out of a downtown hotel on the Calgary Stroll and had been talking about getting into the escort business to avoid the dangers of being on the street. Tracy Maunder was last seen on the 3rd Avenue Stroll in Calgary on October 28, 1992. Tracy's 11-year-old son, Mitchell, was at home alone in their apartment the night she disappeared, waiting for her to come home. On March 11, 1993, a man tending a field discovered the partially clothed remains of 20-year-old Rebecca Boutillier in a heavily traveled area east of McKnight Boulevard and 68th Street, northeast Calgary, meters from a pile of roof shingles. Rebecca had been stabbed to death. Rebecca was born in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. She had moved to Calgary with her mother at just 18 months old, after her father had died in a car accident. Allegedly, Rebecca's childhood was rocky, but she was known to be close to her mother. Rebecca had a son in December of 1991. On February 12, 1993, when Rebecca was 20 and her son was just 15 months old, she disappeared. Rebecca was last seen in the area of 3rd Avenue and 4th Street Southwest in downtown Calgary. She was wearing a waist-length black suede jacket with a front zipper and leather waist which fastened with a brass knuckle. A woman who was working on the streets with Rebecca that night said she might have gotten into a blue car. Rebecca's jacket, purse, and boots have never been found, and investigators believe they were kept by her killer. There was a pile of women's clothing near Rebecca's body. Investigators tracked the clothing to a sex worker in the city who was staying at a motel. The woman was reluctant but did eventually tell police about the night she had a bad date who attacked her inside of a vehicle. The woman couldn't offer any other further details and refused to press charges. The most striking similarity between these cases is the fact that all of these women were seemingly abducted off the streets of Calgary. All were murdered and either dumped in remote areas on the outskirts of the city or their bodies were found in shallow graves. In all of the years that have passed since the murders began, there have been few answers. Reportedly, the Calgary Police Homicide Unit has detectives assigned to these cold cases and are regularly reviewing and re-examining them. The murders of Jennifer Jantz and Rebecca Boutillier are among them. Police are also trying to determine if any of the investigations can benefit from advances in DNA technology and other forensic techniques. The saddest part is the families of these Calgary women still hold out hope for justice. Mitchell Maunder, Tracy Maunder's son, who was only 11 years old when his mother disappeared, launched an investigation of his own when he was just a teen. He hit the streets, questioning those in the dark and dangerous world of cocaine trafficking and prostitution. And his investigation led him to believe that his mother knew her killer. Police and the family of Joanne Shaver were equally frustrated by the acquittal of the man charged with her murder. Helen Shaver, Joanne's mother, has all but given up hope that her daughter's killer will be found. But she worries that others will fall victim to a killer on the loose. Quote, "They were thinking that it was so well planned. He knew what he was doing. They were thinking he had done this before. Afterwards, the police said the case was closed. There was just not enough evidence. But at the back of my mind, if not him, who is it?" Unquote, said Helen Shaver. Jennifer Joyce's cousin fears her once high-profile case has slipped away from public memory. Quote, "We thought we'd hear of more success. It seems so quiet," unquote, said Don Pepper. As I previously mentioned, in 1993, the Calgary Task Force traveled to Edmonton for a serial killer psychological profile meeting with top FBI profilers. They examined possible links between 15 murders, including those of Jennifer Jantz, Jennifer Joyce, and Keely Pincott. It's unclear if they examined the murders of Rebecca Boutillier and Tracy Maunder. But other than that, not much has ever been released from the RCMP in relation to these cases. and no findings from this summit were ever released. Like I mentioned before, in 2003, the RCMP started a project called CARE. This was after examining 82 seemingly similar unresolved cases in Western Canada. Project CARE was initially set up to investigate the deaths of several vulnerable missing persons in the Edmonton area, but later this unit was expanded and became the Alberta RCMP Missing Persons Unit. And several of the murdered young women from Calgary are included in this project. But to date, none of the cases have yet to be solved. Interestingly, police have admitted that there is a serial killer stalking the streets of Edmonton. Some people even think it's possible the same killer has struck in Calgary and Edmonton. I mean, it is possible. The two cities are only a 3-hour drive from each other. So that brings us to a few theories that are floating around. One possible suspect that was investigated in the Calgary murders was a pimp from Lethbridge, Alberta, named Barry Thomas Niedermeyer. In 1991, Niedermeyer was convicted of trafficking a 14-year-old girl in BC who he had met in Calgary. For this crime, Niedermeyer served just 14 months in jail. In 2000, he was charged with 14 offenses against 7 Vancouver sex trade workers. But no evidence has ever been found to link him to the murders in Calgary. Another possible suspect in at least 2 of these murders, those of Tracy Monder in 1992 and Rebecca Boutillier in 1993, is Luc Gregoire, a convicted killer. This connection was made by John Allore and crime writer Patricia Pearson in their book called Wish You Were Here, A Murdered Girl, A Brother's Quest, and the Hunt for a Serial Killer. John Allore's sister, Teresa, had died mysteriously in 1978. The 19-year-old student was from Montreal, and she was found wearing just her underwear. She had no traces of drugs in her system, but her death was dismissed by local police as a drug overdose. This just never sat right with her brother John, and he reached out to his friend and crime writer Patricia Pearson in 2001 to help him explore the possibility that his sister had in fact been murdered. Allore and Pearson got his sister's file reopened and investigated as a cold case. Quote, "First we figured out that Teresa had not in fact been a drug overdose, that she'd actually been murdered. It was a sexual murder. There were other sexual murders in the area in the eastern townships that we felt were connected, and that led us to a suspect, who was in prison for a 1993 really brutal murder in Calgary of a young woman named Lelaine Silva," unquote, Pearson said. That suspect was Luc Gregoire. Gregoire had abducted Silva from her job as a convenience store clerk in a 7-Eleven on Rundlehorn Drive, northeast Calgary in 1993. Using geoprofiling, which maps the local pathways of serial offenders, and help from criminologist Eric Beauregard, an expert in incarcerated violent sexual offenders who had been active in Quebec, the trail led them to Gregoire, who did time in Edmonton for armed robbery and also worked as a roofer in Calgary. A connection emerged between Silva's murder and several other unsolved murders in Calgary. Pearson says they now believe that Gregoire is responsible for at least 2 unsolved sexual homicides of young women in Calgary, those of Tracy Monder and Rebecca Boutillier. Gregoire died in 2015 in a Quebec prison, where he was serving time for Silva's murder. There is another theory that floats around amongst people that the serial killer from Calgary either moved to Edmonton or has always resided in Edmonton, and is the same person that the Edmonton police force are looking for a series of similar murders in the Edmonton area. And like I previously mentioned, the Edmonton police have publicly acknowledged that there is a serial killer in Edmonton. At least 2 of the Calgary cases are known to be linked to the Project CARE in Edmonton. Is it possible that the killer traveled between both cities? Is it possible that the killer lived in Edmonton but went to Calgary from time to time, maybe even for work? Or are the murders totally unrelated, meaning there are two serial killers in Alberta? And finally, some police believe that the killer may be in jail. It's possible the person responsible is currently incarcerated for other crimes, maybe even murder, and is serving a long jail term. Some police think that that is very possible, especially when they think of some of the people who come to their minds as persons of interest. According to an expert who reviewed a series of unsolved Calgary homicide files from the 1990s, there's a strong chance a BC convict serving a life sentence for killing a Vancouver sex trade worker struck in Calgary first. Do you think there was a serial killer in Calgary in the 90s?